All right, so let's jump right into this situation in South Korea. It's pretty wild and things are changing so fast. It's complex.
Yeah.
But we'll break it down.
Yeah, it's really a perfect storm of political maneuvering and accusations of election fraud and, you know, a power vacuum. It's created a real sense of urgency over there.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we're going to focus on Acting President Choi Sang-mok, specifically his controversial decision to appoint these two new justices to the Constitutional Court. And this is VHEAE. That's going to decide if President Yoon Suk-yeol can stay in power. Now, for our listeners who maybe aren't totally up to speed with Korean politics, the Constitutional Court there is kind of like their version of the Supreme Court here. It's the final word on any big legal issues.
Yeah, and to make things even more intense here, you need a two-thirds majority in the court.
Right.
To uphold an impeachment and before these appointments,
Yeah.
the court was basically gridlocked with
Right.
vacancies.
It's a total power move. Choi is only the acting president, but he gets to basically reshape the court right before this huge impeachment trial. No wonder everyone's talking about this. Did he just hand President Yoon a political lifeline? Or is this something else entirely?
Yeah, everyone's trying to figure out his endgame. Some are saying he's just trying to stabilize things, with all this chaos. But others see it as a straight-up betrayal of President Yoon.
Yeah, I've seen a ton of comparisons already to former Vice President Pence and President Trump here in the U.S. Our American listeners might find this pretty familiar.
Yeah, the parallels are definitely there. Just like some conservatives in the U.S. felt like Pence betrayed Trump by not intervening in the election certification. There's a similar sentiment brewing in South Korea right now towards Choi.
It's wild how these political dramas, even in totally different countries, can echo each other. But okay, before we go too deep into those comparisons, let's go back to the beginning. What even led to President Yoon's impeachment in the first place?
Well, it's a long story, but basically it comes down to two main things: accusations of election fraud and President Yoon's decision to declare martial law, which he later rescinded.
Wait, martial law? That sounds intense.
It was definitely controversial, and it really kicked things up a notch. Part of his justification for it was this alleged election fraud. He claimed it undermined the legitimacy of the last National Assembly election, which eventually led to the impeachment of the previous acting president. And that's how Choi ended up in this position in the first place.
This is like something out of House of Cards. Okay, so we've got this backdrop, a president facing impeachment, a controversial declaration of martial law, and now an acting president making these big moves. That could totally change the future of South Korean politics. So where do we go from here?
Well, the next chapter in this drama is the impeachment trial itself. The court is aiming to reach a verdict before April 18th. So things are going to move pretty quickly.
Wow, so less than 4 months for a decision. That could reshape the entire political landscape. What are the possible outcomes here?
Well, if the court upholds the impeachment, President Yoon is out, and they'll have to hold a new presidential election within 60 days. And that's where things get really interesting and concerning for a lot of people.
Especially conservatives.
Exactly. The leader of the opposition Democratic Party, Lee Jae-myung, would be a very strong contender. And his potential victory has a lot of people worried, particularly conservatives. They're concerned about South Korea moving further to the left, aligning more closely with China, and potentially even weakening the alliance with the U.S.
It's like a domino effect. One event triggering this whole chain reaction with huge consequences, not just in South Korea, but internationally.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this impeachment trial looming, but what about these allegations of election fraud? Are they credible, or is this just political mudslinging?
Well, the sources we've been looking at present some pretty intriguing evidence, and it goes way beyond just accusations. Let's start with the shape memory paper controversy. This special type of paper was used for the ballots in the election. It's designed to resist creasing and theoretically prevent tampering.
So they were trying to make the ballots tamper-proof. Sounds like a good idea.
Right, but here's the thing. A significant number of ballots were found creased, which shouldn't have happened if this shape memory paper was working correctly. So it raises some serious questions about the integrity of the election.
Okay, so we've got ballots that shouldn't be creased, but are creased. What else is fueling these allegations?
Well, there's also the issue of the National Election Commission, or the NEC. They've been accused of basically stonewalling investigations, resisting attempts to examine the ballots more closely, and maybe even destroying evidence.
That's pretty suspicious.
Yeah, and it goes beyond just the ballots. There were reports of more votes than registered voters in some areas, ballot boxes left unattended, all sorts of irregularities that the NEC dismissed as errors.
How many errors does it take?
Yeah.
before it starts to look like something more intentional.
Exactly. And then there's this hiring scandal at the NEC with allegations of nepotism and potential evidence shredding. It's not a good look.
Okay, so we've got suspicious ballots, a potentially compromised election commission, and an acting president making these bold moves. That could totally swing the impeachment trial. This is getting more and more complicated by the minute. Before we move on, I want to get your take on something. We've been talking about how Choi's decision could backfire, especially for conservatives. But is there another way to look at this? Could this actually be a strategic move that benefits conservatives in the long run?
That's an interesting question. It leads us to a theory that's been gaining some traction, especially among President Yoon's supporters. It's called the fox hunt strategy, and it basically involves turning the tables on your opponents.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's unpack this fox hunt theory when we come back for part 2. We'll explore the arguments behind it and see if it holds water. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the deep dive. So before the break, we were talking about this theory that's making waves in conservative circles in South Korea. The fox hunt.
Right, and this is where things get really interesting. We were talking about all the ways acting President Choi's decision could backfire on conservatives. But what if it's actually all part of a bigger plan?
Exactly. Some people are saying that President Yoon might actually be orchestrating all of this to expose his enemies and strengthen his position. It might seem chaotic right now, but it could be a trap. Like setting a trap to catch a fox.
Okay, so how does this trap work? What are the signs? That this isn't just a series of bad things happening to President Yoon, but actually a strategy.
Well, let's think back to that martial law declaration. Everyone criticized it as a power grab. But the way it was actually implemented was kind of strange.
So it wasn't a strict lockdown?
No, not really. Regular people were getting stopped and checked, but National Assembly members and their aides weren't really scrutinized that much.
So it was more like a symbolic gesture then, not a real attempt to control the situation.
Right. And that's why some people think it was never really about grabbing power. It was about something else. It was a way to test loyalties within the ruling party.
So this is where the fox hunt comes in.
Exactly. By creating all this confusion, President Yoon could see who was really on his side and who might be siding with the opposition. It was a way to flush out any potential traitors.
Okay, but how do you flesh out someone?
Yeah.
With a martial law declaration.
Well, the sources say that ruling party lawmakers were given conflicting instructions. During this whole period, some were told to go to the National Assembly, while others were told to go to party headquarters. You can imagine the chaos.
Wow, yeah. And in all that chaos, President Yoon could see who was aligning with who.
Exactly. It was like a loyalty test in disguise.
It was a risky move, though, right? Creating chaos in your own party.
Oh, absolutely. It could have easily backfired. But if this theory is right, it means President Yoon is playing a very smart game here.
Okay, but what about the other foxes? The opposition? The people pushing for impeachment? How does this strategy apply to them?
Well, some sources think that President Yoon knew that people would react negatively to the martial law declaration. He knew it would look bad, like he was unstable.
So he was playing the victim.
Maybe. He might have been trying to make his opponents overconfident, make them think they had the upper hand, so they would underestimate him.
So it's like judo. He's using their own force against them.
Exactly. The harder they push, the more they expose themselves, and the stronger he becomes.
But this all depends on him surviving the impeachment, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. If he's removed from office, this whole fox hunt strategy falls apart, and the consequences for South Korea could be pretty bad, especially for conservatives.
And this brings us back to acting President Choi and those controversial appointments. If this fox hunt theory is right, then his actions take on a whole new meaning.
Right. It might not be a betrayal at all. It could be a calculated move, maybe even orchestrated by President Yoon himself to make sure the impeachment trial goes his way.
Okay, let's pause here for a sec. This is a lot to process. We're basically talking about two totally different interpretations of the same events. One hand, we've got a president making rash decisions, maybe because he's paranoid about election fraud, but on the other hand, we've got a master strategist playing this long game, using his opponent's moves to his advantage. Which is it?
That's the million-dollar question. We just don't have all the information, and there's a lot of speculation going on. But even if this fox hunt theory isn't totally true, it makes you think about how we interpret these political events.
It definitely reminds us that things aren't always what they seem. There might be hidden motives and strategies at play that we don't see right away. And in this case, the stakes are incredibly high, Not just for President Yoon and some South Korea, but for the whole region.
For our listeners, especially those of you interested in global politics and the conservative movement, this situation in South Korea is a fascinating case study in how power works, in political maneuvering, and in all the uncertainty of a world that's changing so fast.
Okay, so we've explored this fox hunt theory, but let's not forget the other big piece of this puzzle, the allegations of election fraud. When we come back, we'll dig deeper into those accusations and see if they hold up under scrutiny. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We're in the final part of our look at South Korean politics. It's been a wild ride. We've got a president facing impeachment, an acting president kind of shaking things up, and this fox hunt theory that makes you wonder if someone's pulling the strings.
Yeah, it has been pretty crazy. But we can't forget about the elephant in the room, those allegations of election fraud.
Right, the whole thing with the creased ballots and the National Election Commission. Acting kind of shady. It's easy to get lost in all the political drama. But at the end of the day, the question of whether the election was fair is at the heart of all of this.
Absolutely. And for our listeners who care about fair elections and democracy, this is the part you don't want to miss. So let's go back to those ballots. They use this shape memory paper. And it wasn't just a random choice. It was specifically designed to make it harder to tamper with them, like a safeguard against fraud.
So finding all those creased ballots was a pretty bad sign.
Oh, yeah. It made people wonder if the election was actually legitimate. And it wasn't just a few creased ballots here and there. It was a lot of them, enough to make you think there was a real problem.
Okay, so we've got these potentially messed up ballots. But what about the people running the election? What did the National Election Commission do?
Well, their behavior after the election didn't really help things. They've been accused of blocking investigations and not letting people look at the ballots closely, and maybe even destroying evidence.
Oh, that's pretty bad.
It definitely makes it look like they're hiding something. And it's not just the ballots. Remember we talked about reports of more votes than registered voters and ballot boxes being left alone, all these weird things that happened that the NEC just called errors.
Right, but at some point, you have to wonder if it's more than just mistakes.
Exactly. And then you add in the hiring scandal at the NEC with all the nepotism and the possibility that they were shredding evidence. It starts to paint a really troubling picture.
So we've got these suspicious ballots and a potentially corrupt election commission. Sounds like the whole system might have been rigged.
Yeah.
But let's try to be fair here. Is it possible that this was all just honest mistakes? Could it be incompetence instead of some big conspiracy?
It's possible, but with so many irregularities and the NEC refusing to cooperate, it's hard to believe it was all just an accident. And for a lot of people, especially those who support President Yoon, this isn't about incompetence. It's about someone intentionally trying to steal the election.
So even if President Yoon gets through this impeachment, these accusations are going to follow him. It's hard to move on and be an effective leader when people think you didn't really win.
That's true. And it brings us back to the big question we've been exploring. What does all this mean for South Korea?
Right. What are the consequences of all this chaos? We talked about how President Yoon could be removed and how South Korea could shift politically and maybe get closer to China. But even if he stays in power, there's already been a lot of damage.
Yeah, the trust in the government has been eroded. The country is more divided than ever. The future is really uncertain.
So for our listeners, especially those who are watching the conservative movement and the future of South Korea, this is a warning sign. It shows how fragile democracy can be and how important it is to have fair elections and how dangerous political division can be.
It also shows us that even in democracies, things can change really fast. Things can get out of control. People start pointing fingers. And it's hard to know what the truth is.
It's something to think about. And it reminds us that we need to be careful to think critically and to defend democracy. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one last thought. Things in South Korea are still developing, and we don't know how it's all going to play out.
We encourage you to stay informed, have conversations about this, and think about what it all means, not just for South Korea, but for the whole world. Because what happens in one part of the world can affect all of us. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.